In July of 1997, an avid runner spent the afternoon running errands before driving into Wyoming's Shoshone National Forest to map out a 10K. When she didn't return home by nightfall, her husband knew something was wrong. Friends, family, and volunteers quickly began searching the trails, believing she may have been injured somewhere along her run. But after an extensive search turned up no sign of Amy, investigators began to consider that she may no longer be in the forest at all, and that her disappearance was the result of foul play. As the investigation unfolded, attention turned to Amy's husband. His actions in the days after her disappearance and his limited cooperation with investigators led to years of public debate. Some believed he had been unfairly judged, while others felt there were too many unanswered questions to ignore. At the same time, investigators never ruled out the possibility that Amy had crossed paths with a stranger. That theory gained renewed attention years later, when a suspected serial killer was placed in Lander around the time Amy disappeared. Nearly 30 years later, Amy Wroe Bechtel's disappearance remains one of Wyoming's most enduring mysteries. Was she harmed by someone she knew, or did she become the victim of a chance encounter while out on a training run? After decades of investigation, no one has been able to explain what happened after Amy set out that afternoon. I'm your host, Megan, and each week on A Simpler Time True Crime, I cover older unsolved cases and challenge the idea that a simpler time meant a safer time. This week, I'm bringing to you the unsolved disappearance of Amy Wroe Bechtel. Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining another week of the podcast. This week, I'm bringing to you a case that started in a remote part of Wyoming, but has been talked about across the United States. It was featured on shows like Unsolved Mysteries and on Disappeared on the Investigation Discovery Channel. I think it's one that sticks with people because it's truly a vanished into thin air type of case. But to those who knew and loved her, it's more than a case you debate. In the first few weeks of the search, Amy's brother told the paper that the not knowing was by far the hardest part. And now those weeks have turned into decades of agony and lack of answers. Today I'll talk to you about Amy, her family, her life, and the path of the investigation, and talk through the various scenarios of what could have happened that summer day. At the time of this recording, no one has been charged or convicted in connection with Amy's disappearance. Any individuals discussed as possible suspects or persons of interest are presumed innocent unless and until proven guilty in a court of law. And with that in mind, let's get into it. The Loop Road area of Shoshone National Forest outside Lander, Wyoming, is one of the most scenic and remote parts of the southern Wind River Range. After leaving Sinks Canyon, the road climbs through a series of steep switchbacks into dense forests of lodgepole pine, Engelmann spruce, and Douglas fir, before opening into high mountain meadows and ridgelines with sweeping views in every direction. Along the way are quiet alpine lakes like Fry Lake, Fiddler's Lake, and Lewis Lake, where anglers, campers, and hikers gather together during the short summer season. Wildlife is abundant, and it's not uncommon to spot moose grazing in the marshy meadows, mule deer crossing the road, or hawks circling overhead. Much of the route is unpaved, narrow, and winding, giving it a secluded feel that makes visitors feel far removed from civilization. Despite being only a short drive from Lander, the Loop Road feels rugged and untamed, with the kind of peaceful solitude that defines Wyoming's mountain wilderness. It was here that Amy Bechtel was going to take a jog on the afternoon of Thursday, July 24th, 1997. That day, Amy had kissed her husband Steve goodbye that morning. The pair had been married a little over a year and had just closed on a house together in Lander, Wyoming. Both Amy and Steve were incredibly athletic. Amy was a one-time waitress at the Sweetwater Grill, but in 1997, she worked part-time at Wind River Fitness Center and also at Wild Iris Mountain Sports. She was an amazing runner. In college at the University of Wyoming, she was named to the Western Athletic Conference's 1995 Academic All-Conference Olympic Sports Team in both track and cross country, just to paint you a bit of a picture. Amy's husband, Steve, was a well-known climber in the area. On that morning, when the two kissed goodbye, Steve was heading out about an hour outside of Lander to go rock climbing with a friend. For her day, Amy had a long to-do list. But first, after departing the house, she went to teach a fitness class. It was actually a children's weightlifting class at the Wind River Fitness Center, which is just so adorable. Her colleagues there all said Amy seemed to be in good spirits and nothing seemed out of the norm. She took out the fitness center recycling and then she headed out. After that, she needed to do a bunch of things relating to the move into their new home they just closed on. I'm sure most people listening that you've moved into a new apartment or home before, so this list is familiar, though hers has the extra step many of us don't have to do anymore. She needed to call the phone company to get the landline set up. She also needed to square away her home insurance and get the utilities set up. In the early afternoon, Amy stopped by a place called the Camera Connection. It was a photography shop, and Amy was there to inquire about framing a photo she had taken that she hoped to enter into a competition. She then popped over to another place called Gallery 331 and spoke with a man named Greg Wagner there. He said that she was in running clothes and that she seemed to be in a hurry, glancing at her watch as if to keep a tight schedule. Now, a lot of people read into that, but I will say that makes sense to me, knowing what she planned to do next. Amy was training for a marathon, and locally she was organizing a 10K race that was to take place in September. She wanted to go up into the Shoshone National Forest to take a jog and begin mapping the race out. The route would wind down roads meant for jeeps and mountain bikes. It was a rugged path in an area she loved and had run in many times before. Steve was due to be done with rock climbing late afternoon, so it would make sense that she would want to get up there, get the run done, and all the mapping out she wanted so that she could get home at a decent hour. Amy departed the photography shop at around 2:30 p.m., quickly stopped at that gallery, and then she was off, and that was the last confirmed sighting of her. At around 4:30 that afternoon, Steve returned to their home on Lucky Lane from a day of rock climbing. Amy wasn't home, but that didn't immediately raise any red flags. She was an experienced runner, and spending several hours outdoors wasn't out of the ordinary for her. But she also hadn't left a note stating she was going to be out late, so he did call both places she worked at just to see if she was there, and she wasn't. He then actually showed up to the Wild Iris and asked about her and if anyone knew where she was, but they did not. He then said he started to get kind of annoyed with her, honestly, because he thought that maybe she had gone and taken a spur-of-the-moment trip out to her parents' house and that she didn't tell him, and he was kind of frustrated. At around 8:15 that evening, Steve walked over to the home of his neighbors, Todd and Amy Skinner, while they were making dinner. He mentioned that Amy still hadn't returned home, but that at that point he wasn't overly concerned. Though she hadn't mentioned going anywhere after her run, so it was a little off. The Skinners headed out to a movie while Steve went back home, expecting that Amy would likely return before long. But when Todd and Amy Skinner got back from the movie at around 11 that night, Steve came back over. This time, Amy still hadn't returned, and at that point, the situation felt much different. The three began talking through where she may have gone and quickly focused on the Loop Road area, where Amy had planned to scout a route for the upcoming 10K race. Steve called Amy's parents to see if they had heard from her, but they hadn't. They asked if something was wrong, and in the spirit of not wanting to worry them, he said no. However, not long afterward, he contacted the Fremont County Sheriff's Office to report her missing. While deputies began gathering information, Steve, the Skinners, and others started searching on their own. They drove the winding roads through the national forest, checking trailheads and places where Amy may have parked. Then, at around 1 o'clock the following morning, Todd and Amy Skinner found Amy's white Toyota parked at Burnt Gulch along the loop trail. The car itself didn't immediately suggest anything was wrong. It was unlocked, and inside were Amy's keys, sunglasses, and the handwritten to-do list of errands she had completed earlier that day. There were no obvious signs of a struggle or anything to indicate what had happened after she parked. Amy, however, was nowhere to be found. Her fanny pack and her wallet were also missing, and that was odd because those were usually items she left behind in her car when she took a run. If that's significant or not is kind of TBD, but if her car was unlocked, you almost wonder if in the many hours it was sitting there all afternoon and evening into the early morning hours, if someone took advantage of it being unlocked and took it opportunistically, but unrelated to Amy's disappearance. Or did she on this day decide to run with her wallet and fanny pack? Seems kind of odd to take those things and leave the keys behind. To me, I just operate differently. I always have those types of things on me and my car locked, so I'm having a hard time imagining what would make sense in Amy's norm. The keys were reported to have been found under her to-do list. So we have to ask, is this a distraction, or is the missing fanny pack and wallet something of great significance to her disappearance? We don't know. All we know is that the items not being there is out of the norm, and of course, so is Amy not being there. At this point, the Fremont County Sheriff's Department made their way to the area. Even though finding Amy's vehicle without her in it was concerning, the sense I got was that people thought she likely just twisted her ankle or was injured in some way, and that they just needed to mobilize to look for her. And so that's exactly what they did. It was tricky terrain. By 6 a.m. on Friday morning, Fremont County Search and Rescue was at the scene of her car. As the sun came up, some footprints were found that were thought to be hers right by the car. And then a few additional footprints were found 100 to 200 yards down the way. Initially, there were some footprints that were thought to be hers that went up to a logical turnaround point and then came back down the mountain towards her car. But I will just jump ahead and say that as time went on, the significance of those footprints seems to dissipate, and you'll regularly just hear about one footprint near her car that was maybe hers. I'm not sure completely if it's because they were able to determine that those footprints were definitively not Amy's, or just because they couldn't confirm that they were. It's just something that's never been made super clear. They did follow the route they believed she would have done, and they did so because she had actually put notes on her to-do list sheet that indicated where she was planning on running. And they found that it crossed over one stream, but it was nothing that was super treacherous or anything that they thought Amy would struggle with. One item that was found during the search initially seemed like it could be a significant clue. Searchers recovered a distinctive Zenith clip pen that Steve immediately recognized as Amy's. It wasn't just any pen, it was a relatively expensive pen that Amy typically kept clipped to her wallet. But there was a problem. The pen was found about 3/4 of a mile from her car, in the opposite direction of the route she was expected to have been running. For a few days, investigators treated it as an important lead, and it even influenced where search efforts were focused. That theory began to fall apart when investigators compared the pen to Amy's notes. The notes she had left behind that day were written in blue ink, while the recovered pen contained black ink. Because of that discrepancy, investigators questioned whether it was actually Amy's pen after all. Even today, you'll still see the pen mentioned in some accounts of the case. After all, what are the chances that someone would find the exact same uncommon model pen Amy carried so close to where she disappeared, but in the wrong ink color? Some have wondered if Amy may have owned more than one of those pens in different colors. But there's never been any evidence to support that theory, and because the recovered pen didn't match the one used to write her notes, its significance has remained uncertain. By Saturday, July 26th, these search and rescue teams had dogs out, 2 private helicopters, and more than 100 volunteers to search the area. Almost immediately after the initial search efforts began, local search and rescue teams recognized that the search itself had compromised some potentially valuable evidence. They later acknowledged that best practice would have been to immediately secure the area around Amy's vehicle and allow scent tracking dogs and trackers to work before anyone else entered. But in those first few hours, everyone was simply focused on finding Amy. Friends, family, and volunteers understandably spread out to search. They touched things with her vehicle, and they were walking through the area in hopes of locating her. In the process, any footprints or other ground evidence that may have belonged to Amy became much more difficult to distinguish from everyone else's. It's one of those situations where the urgency to find someone can unintentionally make the investigation more challenging, and the local search teams later used it as a learning opportunity for future missing persons cases. According to reporting from the Casper Star-Tribune, on Sunday, July 27th, the search area expanded to a 20 to 30-mile radius. A handheld infrared detection device was flown over from Cheyenne, and a military Huey from F.E. Warren Air Force Base joined the search. The following day, about 80 searchers combed the areas around Fry, Fiddlers, and Lewis Lakes. A helicopter from the Bureau of Indian Affairs joined the search along with a dozen four-wheel ATVs, but heavy rain did get in the way of their search efforts. During all of this time, one consideration was that Amy could have encountered unpredictable wildlife on her run. In particular, the area where Amy's car was parked was a known grizzly bear location. Mountain lions were also active in the area, but nobody had any recent sightings of either type of wildlife, and as we know, wild animals typically don't try to cover up what they've done, so lack of evidence of an attack left behind made this less likely. So with that being said, by the end of July, about a week into the search, the shift began to lean more into the possibility of foul play. And so the search shifted into areas that someone might hide a body. Law enforcement also asked the general public to come forward if they had been in that part of the park on that afternoon. And this request was twofold. One, they wanted to be able to keep inventory of all the vehicles that had come through so that if they heard of sightings, they could cross-reference and rule people out or determine what vehicles were suspicious and which ones were not. They also, of course, just wanted to know if anyone saw Amy and if they saw anything suspicious. According to the book Rivers of Blood by Robert Scott, a Texas couple was stopped and questioned at a nearby campground area because they were caught driving a stolen car. However, they didn't seem to have any connection to Amy's case. It was just a coincidence. Another couple from the Lander area contacted the sheriff's department to say that they had been driving on Loop Road that day and saw who they thought to be Amy because they noted it to be strange seeing a jogger so far out of town and that far into the wilderness. They said that she was jogging. The area they spotted her in was a stretch of road between the youth camp turnoff and the Sawmill Creek area, and it was around 5 p.m. Another woman came forward to say that she saw a truck that looked just like Steve Bechtel's speeding away from the area in the mountains. Steve countered this with his alibi and said that it was physically impossible for it to be his truck. I found this one interesting because I wondered if this person knew Steve personally or if she described the truck she saw and investigators said, well, did it match this truck, and show her a picture of Steve's. As the investigation pivoted more into a criminal investigation, the physical search was scaled back. Kim Lee, the emergency management coordinator for the county, said, quote, depending on what we find, we'll be scaling down somewhat and moving the search base back down the mountain a ways and into the sheriff's office in Lander. We've just exhausted all of our areas. We need to scale back somewhat and reevaluate the whole thing and go from there. There are some other areas, some canyons and creeks that run back into town that need to be checked again. For the most part, the area that we've been concentrating in has been saturated. End quote. And that's exactly how it played out. The 80-person search party became more targeted and was reduced to 40 people. Many of those remaining were from the rock climbing community that Amy and Steve knew so well. They were best equipped to navigate the terrain, and they knew of the accident-prone places. The area of Lewis Lake was searched when woodcutters reported a foul odor coming from the area, and that they described it as smelling like something had died there. By the time searchers came out, a downpour started that lasted on and off for about 48 hours. So then by the time searchers had the conditions to search the area, they didn't find anything except a deer carcass in the general vicinity. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, detectives were looking for all potential offenders who lived in the area. They were looking for sex offenders, people who had a history of violence against women, and people who had served time in prison for kidnapping. And then they worked to establish their whereabouts during this time. The FBI was pulled in, and they were able to learn that a Russian space station was photographing the U.S. on the day of Amy's disappearance. And they were hoping that if it was the right place at the right time, that maybe satellite images could have captured if another car was in the park with Amy's that day. It was a long shot, and it would take time and red tape, but they were working to make it happen. By early August, Steve spoke out and said that, as horrible as it sounds, he was hoping that she had been abducted because if she was still lost or injured in the wilderness, there was little chance she was still alive. If she had been abducted, well, then there was still hope. During all of this time, there was a unified family search effort between the Wroe family, which was Amy's family, and Steve Bechtel's family. Amy's family had to make their way into town from different parts of Wyoming. Amy had grown up in the Jackson, Wyoming area, and her dad was the first town manager. He was also the town manager of a couple of other small nearby towns as well. The family had moved to the Jackson area from California in 1973 when Amy was about a year old. Immediately after her disappearance, the family mobilized, including her parents and siblings. They set up a family command post at the Bechtel's residence, and the siblings, in-laws, and parents, they were all doing their part to get posters out there, organize searches, do outreach, you name it. Amy's older brother, Nels Wroe, told the Casper Star-Tribune, quote, "If she's lost, she's tougher than anyone I know. If someone's got her, they don't know what the heck they've got a hold of," end quote. The unified effort lasted in the early weeks, but as time wore on, tensions grew, and law enforcement began to shift their focus back to the home. Before we get into the next part, I think it's important to point something out. At this point, the general public believes Steve Bechtel has a full alibi for the time Amy disappeared. He spent the afternoon rock climbing with a friend and didn't get back into the area until 4:30. But as the investigation stalled and there were no real leads as to what happened to Amy, detectives naturally began to take a closer look at the people closest to her, including Steve and their relationship. Investigators obtained a search warrant for the Bechtel home and Steve's truck. Initially, parts of that search were simply to collect DNA in the event that Amy's body was ever found and comparisons needed to be made. But they were also looking for anything else that might point them in a direction. They collected what they described as possible biological evidence from Steve's truck, along with various items from inside the home. One thing detectives wanted to know was whether Amy kept a diary. Steve told them he didn't think so. He said she kept travel journals, but not a personal diary. As it turned out, though, Steve had been keeping journals of his own for years, dating back to high school, and investigators seized those as well. When it came to the physical evidence collected from the truck and the home, detectives later said they found nothing that suggested a crime had occurred in either location. The journals, however, became a different story. Their contents have never been released publicly, so everything we know comes from investigators' descriptions, along with what Amy's family has said after being allowed to read portions of them. According to law enforcement, the journals contained reoccurring themes involving power, violence, death, controlling women, and even writings describing murder and disposing of a body. One phrase that has repeatedly been reported was "power is the ultimate aphrodisiac," though that quote is commonly attributed to Henry Kissinger. Without seeing the journals ourselves, it's impossible to know the full context of any individual passage. Amy's family has described the writings as deeply disturbing. Her brother said the journals were detailed and chronologically organized and reflected what he believed were Steve's views around women in control. Amy's mother has also said that she was shocked after investigators shared portions of the journals with the family. Looking back, Amy's relatives also remembered noticing bruises on her at one point. Amy reportedly brushed it off by saying, "Steve gets a little rough sometimes." At the time, they didn't think much of it. After Amy disappeared, though, that memory took on a different significance for them. It's important to note that there has never been any public evidence establishing a history of domestic violence between Steve and Amy. Steve has consistently maintained that the journals did not reflect his real thoughts or intentions. He said that they were a mixture of song lyrics, fictional stories, and creative writing, explaining that writing down dark thoughts was simply a way of getting them out of his head. Around the same time, Steve was interviewed by the FBI. According to Steve, investigators became increasingly confrontational during the interview, telling him they had proof he had killed Amy and insisting that he take a polygraph exam. Steve later told reporters that he became uncomfortable with the direction of the interview and chose to end it. Not long afterward, he hired prominent Wyoming defense attorney Kent Spence. Spence has said that he advises all of his clients not to take polygraph exams because he considers them unreliable and that they're inadmissible in court. That decision became another source of tension. Some members of Amy's family felt Steve should take the polygraph to eliminate himself as a suspect. Others believed it wouldn't accomplish anything. Steve himself has said that at a time he thought he wanted to take the test at first, but he felt his attorney strongly advised against it. In later interviews, Steve also said he was worried that the machine would misinterpret normal nervousness or even something as simple as sweating as deception. Whatever the reason, Steve never took the polygraph. Both the Fremont County Sheriff's Office and the FBI publicly stated that they believed Steve was not fully cooperating with the investigation. Their position was that they wanted to either eliminate him as a suspect or continue pursuing him based on the evidence, and they felt they couldn't do that without his cooperation. Amy's parents echoed that frustration in interviews with the Casper Star-Tribune. They said they believed valuable time was being spent focusing on Steve because investigators were unable to definitively rule him out, and they wished he would just cooperate. Amy's older brother, Nels Wroe, was more direct. After looking at the journal entries, he described them as, quote, flat out shocking and consistent with what I'd been suspicious of for a long time, end quote. He stated that Steve was controlling of Amy, and that on 5 separate occasions, Nels had questioned Amy about controlling behavior and suspected abuse and that she dodged his questioning. Steve denied that there were any major problems in their marriage, and he also denied being controlling. He acknowledged that they had arguments like any couple, saying most of their biggest issues actually happened before they were married. He also firmly denied that there had ever been any physical abuse in their relationship. As public attention shifted towards Steve, the media coverage became increasingly intense. One Casper Star-Tribune article titled "Suspecting the Worst" painted a picture that many readers felt cast Steve in a highly suspicious light. In the weeks that followed, the newspaper published numerous letters from people who knew Steve and his family. Many argued that the coverage had been unfair, that it sensationalized an already devastating situation, and that it deepened the divide between two families who were both living through an unimaginable tragedy. When it comes to those family dynamics, I honestly can't imagine what either side was experiencing. Amy's family desperately wanted answers. Steve was living under a cloud of suspicion while also maintaining that he had nothing to do with his wife's disappearance. Those are incredibly difficult realities to reconcile. I also think it's important to acknowledge that two things can be true at the same time. The journals may very well have contained disturbing thoughts. Steve himself has never disputed that he wrote them, only what they meant. It's also possible that aspects of their relationship were far from perfect. We simply don't know everything that happened behind closed doors. At the same time, none of those things on their own prove that Steve harmed Amy. They may explain why investigators continued to scrutinize him, but suspicion is not the same thing as proof. And as this investigation continued to evolve, detectives eventually began looking beyond Amy's immediate circle and exploring other possibilities as well. As they began looking beyond Steve, they also explored another possibility, whether someone outside of her immediate circle had become fixated on her. According to investigators, while Amy was in college, there were at least a couple of men whose interest in her crossed personal boundaries. At the time, law enforcement said their behavior didn't quite rise to the level of what they considered stalking. One man, a person named Kelly McLeod, connected with Amy when she worked at a local coffee shop. According to the book Rivers of Blood, Kelly had been on the run from law enforcement for 7 years when he first encountered Amy. The two hit it off as friends, and she introduced him to running. He even entered a couple of races. But he began to grow obsessive of Amy, calling her, following her, and she grew concerned. Today, repeated unwanted contact and following someone would likely be viewed much differently than it was in the mid-90s, and likely it would be more apt to be classified as stalking. We know that we've learned a lot about stalking since then. At some point, Kelly disappeared again, and police began to try to track him down to see where he was on the day of Amy's disappearance. They couldn't find him, but rumor was that he was in eastern Canada, far away from Lander. In the fall of '97, Sheriff Larry Matthews and his team searched an abandoned mine. He stated that there were no new leads or evidence that led them to search there, just that they were trying to eliminate places where you might find a body. The community was committed to finding Amy, and a bunch of fundraisers were held with a $10,000 reward raised for information. Amy's 10K race continued to be organized by Steve and was carried out in September as planned, except it was in her honor. According to the book Rivers of Blood by Robert Scott, Steve said to the crowd, quote, "Amy had wanted to do this race for a couple of years. She was told the only people who would show would be 8 of her former track teammates." And then a bunch of people started cheering. There were actually 146 runners there. He then said, "We're in this together. We know Amy's alive." In January of 1998, the FBI learned that they were not going to be able to get their hands on any satellite photos from the Russian space station. While they had been taking photos of the Wind River mountain range that day, the skies were overcast, and so nothing of value could be seen. Just another dead end in a series of dead ends. During that same month, Amy's 2 sisters, Casey and Jenny, went on the Geraldo Rivero talk show, and they made a public plea to Steve to cooperate with police and take a polygraph. But as you can imagine, he did not. Then, the following month, investigators publicly revealed another reason they remained focused on Steve. They said they could not fully account for his whereabouts between approximately 2:30 and 5 p.m. on the day Amy disappeared. Steve told investigators he had spent that afternoon rock climbing with a friend named Sam in the mountains near Du Bois, Wyoming. Sam corroborated Steve's account, but investigators said they were unable to independently verify that either man had actually been there. No witnesses came forward who remembered seeing them in the area that afternoon. Whether that's unusual is open to interpretation. The area where they said they had been climbing, it's remote, and it's certainly possible to spend hours outdoors without encountering anyone who would later remember you. Steve also said he had stopped at a hardware store and purchased a climbing hammer that day in Du Bois, but he no longer had the receipt, so investigators were unable to use that purchase to verify his timeline. Investigators also asked Sam to take a polygraph exam, but just like Steve, he declined. We've already talked about why people make that decision, so I won't belabor the point here. It certainly made things more frustrating for investigators, but it also wasn't an unexpected response. Investigators were able to account for Steve's movements again beginning at around 5 p.m. when he placed a long-distance phone call from Lander. From that point through the rest of the evening, they were able to piece together his whereabouts until Amy was officially reported missing. Detective King later said Steve's demeanor during the phone call reporting Amy missing struck him as unusually casual, even lighthearted at times. Investigators viewed that as significant. At the same time, Steve also had reassured Amy's parents earlier in the evening that everything was probably fine because he didn't want to worry them. I don't know whether those two things are connected, but I do think they're both worth considering when trying to understand his mindset that night. And of note, people who were with Steve personally said that in reality, he was panicked and frantic. By March of 1998, police finally tracked down Kelly McLeod, the man who had allegedly been obsessed with Amy back in college. The original reason he was on the run when he met Amy was because he jumped bail in Kentucky. In March of 98, he was arrested in Medford, Oregon, and authorities in Lander were notified so they could question him. He cooperated and was able to prove that he was indeed on the East Coast on the date of Amy's disappearance. However, Detective King said, quote, McLeod offered valuable information to us of a personal nature about Amy and about Amy and Steve's relationship. We didn't hear anything unexpected, end quote. Around the country, there continued to be reported sightings of Amy. One in Florida in April of 98 was so uncanny that investigators thought approaching her that it just had to be Amy, but it turned out to just be a lookalike, and it was an unhoused woman from Washington state. More searches took place in targeted areas, but nothing turned up. By this point, the investigation seemed to be at a standstill. Much of the attention remained on Steve Bechtel. But given time, another name would enter the picture and shift the direction of the investigation. Beyond just false sightings, investigators had to fully investigate the rumors that came across their desks. For example, one rumor led to a major investigation throughout 1999 and 2000. During this time, 3 people living on the Wind River Reservation were rumored to have been involved in Amy's disappearance. According to the story circulating at the time, they had been drinking and using drugs on the day Amy disappeared, and they accidentally struck her with a vehicle while she was out running. From there, the rumors diverged. Some versions claim they killed her outright, while others said she survived the initial impact but later died from her injuries. In every version of the rumor, Amy's body was supposedly buried somewhere on the reservation. The Fremont County Sheriff's Office took the allegations seriously enough that investigators devoted nearly 2 months and about $5,000 in interviewing suspects and following up on the claims. With permission from tribal authorities, they even excavated areas where the body was allegedly buried. In the end, investigators found nothing to support the story. 2 of the 3 individuals voluntarily took polygraph exams. All 3 cooperated with investigators, and no evidence connected them to Amy's disappearance. Sheriff King ultimately dismissed the allegations, saying, quote, "We've concluded that the story is just a rumor. We're satisfied that they were not involved with Amy," end quote. The investigation had reached a point where it felt like it was running in circles. Searches continued, rumors were investigated and ruled out, and much of the attention remained focused on Steve Bechtel. But eventually, another name would emerge, and with it, an entirely different theory about what may have happened to Amy. To understand why investigators began looking at this new suspect, we have to go back almost a decade before Amy disappeared. On March 25, 1988, 18-year-old Lisa Marie Kimmel left Denver, Colorado for what should have been a routine drive home from Billings, Montana. Her mother had actually flown home the day before because she had a ski trip planned, and Lisa intended to make the drive on her own. Along the way, she planned to stop in Cody, Wyoming to pick up her boyfriend Ed before the two continued on to Billings together. To get there, Lisa would spend hours driving through Wyoming. She headed north on Interstate 25 before eventually leaving the interstate for the rural highways that wind through central Wyoming toward Cody. If you've ever driven through that part of the state, you know there are long stretches where it's just you, the road, and miles of open country. Towns can be dozens of miles apart, and after dark, it can feel incredibly isolated. At 9:06 that evening, Lisa was stopped for speeding near Douglas, just east of Casper. The interaction itself was completely routine. She tried to pay the ticket at an ATM, but her debit card wasn't compatible with the machine. The trooper told her she could simply mail in a check once she got home to Billings, and they went their separate ways. That traffic stop would become the last confirmed sighting of Lisa Marie Kimmel. There was one unconfirmed report of Lisa being seen at a grocery store in Casper around 10 p.m., but investigators were never able to verify it. The following day, Lisa's boyfriend called her parents to ask where she was. She had never arrived in Cody to pick him up. Her family reported her missing immediately. 8 days later, the search came to a heartbreaking end. Lisa's body was discovered floating in the North Platte River near Casper. Investigators determined she had been kidnapped, sexually assaulted, beaten, stabbed, and thrown into the river. Her distinctive Honda CRX bearing the personalized license plate Lil Miss was nowhere to be found. The case quickly became one of Wyoming's most recognizable unsolved murders. Lisa's license plate was featured on billboards throughout the region, and her story was eventually highlighted on Unsolved Mysteries. Despite the publicity, investigators couldn't identify who had taken her. The case slowly grew cold. For more than a decade, Lisa Marie Kimmel's murder remained unsolved. Then, almost 10 years later, another violent crime would set in motion the events that finally identified her killer. In September of 1997, just a couple of months after Amy disappeared, Scott and Shannon Breeden were driving home to Washington with their 5-month-old son when their van broke down alongside Interstate 80 in southern Wyoming. The location was roughly 150 miles south of Lander, in an area known for vast stretches of open desert where services are few and far between. If you've never driven through that part of Wyoming, picture miles and miles of sagebrush, rolling hills, and highway with very little in between. It's the kind of place that if your vehicle breaks down, you may not see another person for quite some time. The Breedens tried flagging down passing motorists. A few truck drivers stopped long enough to say they would notify someone that a stranded family needed assistance, but no help ever came. They spent the entire night on the side of the interstate. By the following morning, they had been stranded for nearly 18 hours. Their water supply was running low. They had a 5-month-old baby to care for, along with a dog and even a kitten they were transporting home. They were beginning to run out of options, and as you can imagine, feeling desperate. Then, finally, someone stopped. His name was Dale Wayne Eaton. At first, he seemed like exactly the person they had been hoping for. Eaton offered to drive Scott into town to get parts for the disabled van. The family hopped into Eaton's vehicle, but instead of heading toward civilization, he drove off Interstate 80 and into Wyoming's Red Desert, an enormous, sparsely populated landscape covering thousands of square miles. Once they were far enough from the highway that no one was likely to witness what was happening, Eaton pulled out a rifle. He ordered Scott out of the truck and forced him to walk away. Then he turned his attention to Shannon, who was still holding their infant son. Investigators believe Eaton was attempting to isolate Shannon, but before he could, Scott made the decision to fight back. Scott rushed Eaton, and the two men struggled over the rifle. During the fight, Scott managed to gain control of the weapon and struck Eaton in the head with it. Scott was also carrying a pocket knife and stabbed Eaton during the struggle. The attack created just enough opportunity for Shannon to escape with their baby. The family fled, eventually finding help while Eaton disappeared into the desert. How scary must that have been? You've survived this sudden attack at the hands of a madman after already being stranded on the side of the road for hours, and now you're back trying to flag down help to get help, but this scary man is in the wilderness with you. It's truly out of a horror movie. Luckily, somehow, they were able to get help. Law enforcement quickly identified Eaton as the attacker, and prosecutors charged him in connection with the assault. Unfortunately, they were unable to secure a conviction for kidnapping because they couldn't prove every legal element of that offense beyond a reasonable doubt. He was, however, convicted on federal firearms charges because, as a convicted felon, he was prohibited from possessing the rifle he used during the attack. At the time, no one realized just how significant that conviction would become. While Eaton was incarcerated, authorities collected his DNA. Years later, in 2002, advances in forensic testing allowed investigators to compare that DNA to biological evidence preserved from the murder of Lisa Marie Kimmel. The result was a match. For investigators who had spent 14 years trying to solve Lisa's murder, it was the break they had been waiting for. Armed with the DNA evidence, they obtained a search warrant for Eaton's property. And during that search, they made an astonishing discovery. Buried on the property was Lisa's missing Honda CRX, the very car she had been driving the night she disappeared. It still bore the personalized license plate that had become known throughout Wyoming and beyond, Lil Miss. The discovery of Lisa's car, along with the DNA evidence, left investigators with little doubt about what could have happened to her. Dale Wayne Eaton was ultimately convicted of kidnapping, sexually assaulting, and murdering Lisa Marie Kimmel. According to an inmate of Eaton's, he admitted that Lisa had given him a ride. Now, I'm not sure if that was at that store that someone said they saw her at, like maybe he was waiting outside the store, or if he was hitchhiking. But once he was in her vehicle, he made sexual advances at her. She rebuffed his advances and asked him to get out of her vehicle, and it all escalated from there. Solving Lisa's case also caused investigators to take a second look at other unsolved disappearances around Wyoming. Eaton wasn't just a man convicted of one horrific murder. By that point, investigators already knew him as someone with a lengthy criminal history. Over the years, he had been convicted of burglary, assault, and other crimes, and he had repeatedly come to law enforcement's attention for violence and sexually motivated behavior. He also spent much of his life living, working, and traveling throughout central Wyoming. He knew the highways, the back roads, and the isolated public lands as well as just about anyone. Because of that history, Eaton's name wasn't new to investigators. One of the more recent detectives, Detective John Zerga, has since said that he always existed somewhere on their list of possible suspects, but after the Kimmel case was solved, his name suddenly carried a lot more weight. Investigators began working with the detectives who had solved Lisa's murder. They interviewed members of Eaton's family, consulted with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, and started digging into where Eaton had been in July of 1997. One of the people who really pushed that effort forward was Detective John Zerga. Years after Amy disappeared, Zerga inherited the cold case and took a fresh look at the investigation. As he dug deeper, he uncovered information, including statements from Eaton's own brother, suggesting Eaton had been in the Lander area around the time Amy vanished. So all of a sudden, investigators had another theory they couldn't ignore. What if Amy's disappearance had nothing to do with someone in her personal life? What if she had simply crossed paths with the wrong person while out for an afternoon run? That possibility became even more compelling because Eaton wasn't just being looked at in Amy's case. Around that same time, some investigators, along with FBI profilers, began wondering whether he could be responsible for a number of unsolved murders and disappearances of women across Wyoming, Utah, Nevada, and Idaho. The media eventually gave that unknown offender a name: the Great Basin Killer. The theory was that a single predator had been targeting women along the remote highways and deserts of the American West for years, using the isolation of the region to his advantage. Amy's disappearance didn't fit that theory perfectly, but it shared enough similarities that investigators believed it deserved a closer look. Today, many investigators believe the so-called Great Basin murders were likely committed by multiple offenders rather than one serial killer. But at the time, the theory was taken seriously, and Eaton quickly became one of the leading names associated with it, especially because the Great Basin murders seemed to stop in 1997. For Detective Zerga, that meant Amy's case wasn't just about re-examining the evidence that had already been collected. It also meant asking whether investigators had been looking in the wrong direction all along. John Billman did a piece for Runner's World magazine in 2016 covering Amy's case and where the investigation had turned in recent years. It was in that article that Detective Zerga's work on the case beginning in 2010 was highlighted, and how he became interested in Eaton. He traveled to visit Dale's brother and sister-in-law in 2012, and they told Detective Zerga that they were sure that Dale was camping in the area during the exact time Amy went missing. Zerga told Runner's World, quote, "I told his brother that's not a place to camp. The area is, like the name has it, a gulch, and there are more picturesque camping spots close by," end quote. However, his brother Richard Eaton described in detail the beaver ponds and a fire wheel and other specific geographical details of the area. So Zerga said, quote, "To me, once Richard said Dale was up there when she went missing, and he has those capabilities, immediately that went up to the top," end quote. After he was convicted of Lisa Kimmel's murder, a jury sentenced Dale Wayne Eaton to death. Years later, however, in 2014, a federal judge overturned the death sentence, ruling that Eaton's attorneys had not done an adequate job presenting mitigating evidence during the sentencing phase of his trial. His conviction for Lisa's murder was never overturned, just the sentencing. Wyoming initially planned to seek the death penalty again, but before a new sentencing hearing could take place, Eaton suffered multiple strokes and was diagnosed with dementia. He was ultimately found incompetent to go through another death penalty proceeding, and prosecutors instead agreed to do a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole, where he remains today. With the death penalty off the table, Detective Zerga didn't have a lot of negotiating power to get Eaton to talk, and he chose not to. And as the years have gone on, he has had a significant cognitive decline. According to Detective Zerga, he still has looked into Steve. They have done luminol testing at the home on Lucky Lane. He even followed up on a rumor that Steve had buried Amy below the driveway of their new home before the concrete had set, a home on McDougal Drive. That didn't produce anything. Detective Zerga even discussed how luminol would show blood even after new paint, but nothing came up. They have taken cadaver dogs around without any hits. Steve Bechtel seemed to like the new detective and the work he was doing on Amy's case. Steve got remarried after having Amy declared dead in the early 2000s. Still, despite his appreciation for the more recent detectives on the case, he has never done a polygraph exam still. There are people in Amy's family who are still suspicious of him, and people who have taken interest in Amy's case that are as well. Steve told John Billman in Runner's World, quote, "Living is so fascinating. I have these two little kids, and more than anything in my life, those two are what I was born for, to raise those kids. It means everything to you. And the thing that's a really profound challenge emotionally for me is knowing that those two kids never would have existed if I would have been able to keep hold of Amy. You look through history and these tragedies happen in order for wonderful things to happen," end quote. He then said of Amy, quote, "It breaks your heart. She was so cool, John. Her greatest fault was that she was so friendly. She was always taken advantage of. I'll take your shift. I'll watch your dog. It just makes you so sad. You could take the strongest woman, a Division I athlete, and the average guy is going to be able to overpower her. And a man will be able to sprint faster, and he's going to have the capability of overpowering this woman. There's a fantasy of knowing self-defense moves, or that an athletic woman, a runner especially, is going to be able to outrun a guy. In practice, that just doesn't occur, I don't think," end quote. Nearly 30 years have passed since Amy Wroe Bechtel went out for an afternoon run and never came home. In that time, investigators have searched countless miles of wilderness, chased down rumors, scrutinized the people closest to her, and explored the possibility that a violent stranger crossed her path that day. There have been compelling theories, strong suspects, and moments that seemed like they might finally bring answers. But in the end, what happened to Amy remains unknown. Some people believe it's Steve. Some believe it's Dale Wayne Eaton. Some believe it could be another person who was out there in the wilderness that day who has never been identified. And some believe that Amy did suffer some sort of accident and has just never been found. No matter where you believe the evidence points, one thing hasn't changed. Amy's family has spent nearly 3 decades without knowing what happened to their daughter and sister. Steve Bechtel has lived for decades under the weight of public suspicion while maintaining his innocence. Friends, investigators, and an entire community have been left with questions that still haven't been answered. The hope now is the same as it was in July of 1997, that someone, somewhere, knows something that could finally explain what happened to Amy. Until that day comes, her disappearance remains one of Wyoming's most enduring mysteries, and one that deserves to be remembered, not because of the theories or the speculation, but because Amy herself still deserves the answers that have eluded everyone for far too long. If you have any information on the disappearance of Amy Wroe Bechtel, please contact the Fremont County Sheriff's Office at 307-332-5611. This has been another episode of A Simpler Time True Crime. Just a quick PSA, be sure to follow me on Instagram at Simpler Time Crime Pod if I ever have bonus episodes coming out, which I did recently. Extra commentary on the episodes, pictures to correspond with the case, or a change in recording schedule, it's always announced on there, so that will keep you up to date. It would mean the world to me if you could take 2 minutes to leave a 5-star review on the show on any of your preferred listening platforms. Also, telling your friends about the show helps me grow and gets these cases in front of a bigger audience. Case suggestions can be made to simplertimecrimepod@gmail.com, as well as DMing me on Instagram. As always, thank you so much for listening, and join me again next Monday.